So Parasite is the movie that made Bong Joon-ho a household name all around the world. Now, when I made this YouTube channel, I knew that Parasite was going to be the one movie that I did not really want to talk about. And that's because, as much as I enjoyed that movie, practically everyone with a YouTube channel already has made a video about Parasite, and I didn't think that I could come up with anything original to say about it. But thankfully for me, my favorite Bong Joon-ho movie isn't Parasite, but rather Snowpiercer. So, Snowpiercer is a movie that came out in 2013. Now, there's a TV show based on that movie, but I haven't yet seen that TV show yet, and so I will not be focusing on that at all. I'll just be talking about this movie. Now, this movie has a lot of heavy themes in it. There's a lot of things that we can dissect about this movie and talk about. In fact, before I started this YouTube channel, way before I started my Twitter page, I started out as a blogger, and one of the things that I wrote about in that blog was about this movie, so I'm going to provide a link down below as well. Now, if you decide to read that blog in advance, you're going to be able to get some of the gist of what I'm about to say, but I wrote that blog post about 7 years ago where I talked about the various philosophical arguments that I made in that movie. But it's been 7 years, and I believe that some of my views might have changed, and so this video is going to be an update on that blog post that I made 7 years ago now. So let's talk about the synopsis of Snowpiercer real quick. Now, when this movie begins, we're given some text on the screen so that we can get some exposition real quick. Now, when the movie begins, due to uncontrolled global warming, several governments of the world get together and decide to come up with an artificial solution to the global warming problem. And the solution that they come up with is a global coolant that they call CW7. So in order to reduce the temperatures to more manageable levels, the governments of the world decide to stockpile these chemicals into planes, and the planes then just fly all around the planet and they start to spray the atmosphere with CW7. Unfortunately, what CW7 does is that instead of cooling the temperature to a much more manageable level, it plunges the whole world into a new ice age. Now, due to this artificial ice age, the movie makes it clear that all life on Earth has become extinct, and this is going to be an important plot point that we're going to keep coming back to. But thankfully for humanity, the very last remnants of humanity decides to board this train called the Snowpiercer. And the way that the society in Snowpiercer has been divided is that the people who are able to afford to pay for the tickets were at the front of the train or the middle of the train or what have you, but there were people who boarded the train without having paid tickets. They were stowaways, and the stowaways basically are kept into the back end, the tail end of the train. And these stowaways are treated like basically human chattel. Now, the people at the tail end of the train, well, they did manage to survive the global ice age, but their survival came at a cost. Although they survived, by surviving at the back end of the train without having paid for their tickets, they are bullied, they are subjugated, they are oppressed, they are not given any rights or privileges. In fact, they are also malnourished most of the time. And so, because of this stratification of the societies from the front of the train to the back of the train, due to all of the unintended consequences that led to the society in this one train, there are a lot of themes to explore in Snowpiercer. By the way, there's a key phrase that I just mentioned just now, unintended consequences. This is a theme that we're going to come back to repeatedly as we talk about this movie. From the very solution to the global warming crisis that the movie talks about, everything started with unintended consequences, and we're going to talk about how unintended consequences just keep coming up all across this movie. And because I said just now that there are a lot of themes to cover in this video, we're not going to talk about Snowpiercer in this one video. That would take way too long. So instead, I'm going to cut this down into several videos and talk about one theme at a time. And now that we're done with the synopsis, let's start with the movie's most obvious themes, which are dictatorship and rebellion. And when this movie begins, after we're done with all the exposition by text, the movie begins with 17 years having passed after the Ice Age has begun. And so a lot of time has already progressed. There have been generations of children born on this train who have never stepped outside of the train before. And it's important to point out that people are not allowed to get off the train. That's because the moment they step off the train, they will just freeze to death instantaneously. Now, Snowpiercer doesn't waste any time in introducing us to the movie's main protagonist, who is portrayed by none other than Captain America, Chris Evans, or who is known as Curtis in this movie. Now, Curtis is one of the younger and more headstrong ideological leaders who wants to start this revolution and take it all the way to the front of the train. Now, the leader of this train, the man who designed this train and who is at the engine, way at the front, his name is Wilford, and he is portrayed by Ed Harris. And Chris Evans' role as this revolutionary fighter, he wants to start this revolution so they can take it all the way to the front of the train, so they can kill all the leaders who have brutalized the people at the tail end, so that they can have a more equitable and just society. Now, although Curtis is a young and passionate fighter who is at the front of the revolution, he is not the revolution's spiritual leader. The spiritual leader is a man named Gilliam, who is portrayed by the late John Hurt. Now, during these conversations between Curtis and Gilliam, we realize that this revolution that Curtis is planning is not the first revolution that the tailenders have tried. There have been many revolutions before, but they've all failed. And the reason why they've all failed, at least according to Curtis, is that they never managed to take the revolution all the way to the front of the train, to the engine. And Curtis plans to succeed in his revolution by going all the way. And during this discussion between Curtis and Gilliam, Gilliam asks what Curtis's plans are. And when Curtis mentions that he wants to go to the front of the train, Gilliam asks a rather cryptic question. And the question is, and then what? And Curtis doesn't really have an answer to that beyond just kill them all. And this is another theme that we're going to get back into.
From here right to the front of the train. Everything in one stroke. We control the engine, we control the world. Without that, we have nothing. All past revolutions have failed because they couldn't take the engine.
What you saying?
This time we take the engine.
Then what?
We kill him.
Wilford?
Now, Snowpiercer came out in 2013, 7 years ago now, and I know that a lot of things have happened this year, and so people might not be able to remember something that happened that long ago, but when this movie came out in 2013, it was a very timely movie, and that's because at the time, just a year prior to this movie coming out, the world had witnessed what was now known as the Arab Spring. Now, when the Arab Spring began in the early 2010s, it was an amazing and a phenomenal social movement that took a lot of people in the world by surprise. And that's because, fairly or not, whenever most people think of the Middle East, people tend to associate that region of the world with authoritarians or Islamists or terrorists. But the Arab Spring changed people's minds about that part of the world, and that's because for the first time in a really long time, the people in the Middle East were just fed up with the authoritarian leaders that they had to put up with. They were giving a huge middle finger to their authoritarian leaders and to the Islamists. They wanted freedom, and the people were not shy about demanding freedom from their oppressors. From Egypt to Lebanon to Libya to Syria, there were people all around these countries that we've always just associated with authoritarianism who were willing to brave the streets, who were willing to brave the armies and the police and say that they were tired of living under autocratic leaders and that they wanted to be free. And this was a time of great social upheaval and social change, and there was a lot of potential for really fundamentally good change and evolution in that part of the world. Now, the early 2010s was a horrible time to be a dictator, especially a Middle Eastern dictator. Now, for example, people thought that Egypt's Hosni Mubarak or Libya's Muammar Gaddafi were going to be sticking around forever, but as it turns out, they're not there anymore, and that was in no small part due to the protests that the Arab people had led in that part of the world. It was nothing short of astounding. These dictators who had ruled their countries with an iron fist for decades were suddenly no longer in charge. But the thing about ending dictatorships via revolutions is that history has shown that revolutions don't always succeed. Sometimes they can backfire. In Egypt, after Hosni Mubarak was ousted, he was replaced by the Muslim Brotherhood, but even they didn't last that long because about a year into it, they were replaced by the military. And Egypt was one of the lucky few countries. Other countries like Yemen, Libya, and Syria, they're in the middle of bloody civil wars. And so, the question that Gilliam asked in this movie, what next, is, as it turns out, is a really pertinent question. Now, in order to explain the relevance of revolutions and dictatorships and the Arab Spring to this movie, I'm going to go into spoilers territory real quick. Now, Curtis's revolution does eventually succeed. He goes to the front of the train, he confronts Wilford, and he kills Wilford. Now, a lot of other things happen in the meantime, but we're going to get into that later. So, after Curtis kills Wilford, what happens? The train gets derailed, everyone aboard the train dies because the train is no longer running, which is necessary for everyone to keep surviving, and that's the end of the movie. The train is no longer running, it gets completely derailed. And so that ties in with what happened in the real world as well. In the real world, after the Arab Spring, everything got derailed, just like the train in Snowpiercer. And so the question that Gillian asks comes up again. What happens after the revolution? Is revolution always the best solution to end dictatorships? And the answer to that question, of course, is complicated. Yes, dictatorships are always bad. Dictatorships are always bad. But revolutions are not always a solution, and that's because revolutions, sometimes they can lead to positive outcomes, sometimes they can lead to negative results, sometimes they can backfire tremendously, and there are far too many factors that go into it to actually say that revolutions are good or bad. A lot of it depends on the circumstances. But let's get back to the Arab Spring. Now, when the Arab Spring was still ongoing, people thought that this was going to be the beginning of a new chapter in human history. We thought that this was going to lead to a new democratic movement, but as it turned out, the Arab Spring failed. And the question is, why did it fail? Well, it's not because the Arab Spring did not have credible leaders. It's not because the protesters were naive. It's not because the autocrats were too powerful. There were far more complicated reasons. Now, in the movie, Curtis was a charismatic leader. Curtis was not naive, but his revolution also failed as well. And the reason why the revolutions in the movie and the real world failed is not because of a lack of brave individuals, but rather because of institutional failure. In the real world, civil institutions in places like Egypt and Libya were very weak, and they were weak by design. Hosni Mubarak and Muammar Gaddafi decided to strip civil institutions of any sort of powers that they could have. Lawyers associations, NGOs, chambers of commerce. These institutions are really boring institutions that no one is going to make a movie about. But these are the kinds of institutions that are necessary to eventually form a backbone of a society. But autocrats almost always go after these institutions because autocrats can never stay in power for long if these institutions are there to make sure that society doesn't crumble. In the case of Hosni Mubarak, what he did was that he staffed all of these governmental agencies with loyalists instead of people who were competent or good at doing their jobs. And because he had staffed every one of these government institutions with loyalists, when Hosni Mubarak left, all of these institutions failed. And that was by design. And in America's case, this is precisely the reason why Donald Trump is not a dictator. It's not because he didn't try, I'm sure that he gave it his all. But America is not a dictatorship despite Donald Trump's best efforts because of the existence of these civil societies. Now, Curtis leads his ragtag band of revolutionaries from the tail end of the train all the way up to the engine room. But at no point during that process does he stop to talk to the other people in the train who might be affected by his revolution. He doesn't get to persuade or convince others to join him in his cause. It's just one violent fight after another. And eventually when he reaches Wilford, Wilford is the one-man show. He's the one who's been in charge of the whole thing, and once Wilford is gone, there's nothing to keep order in the train. And that is why after Curtis kills Wilford, before the train gets derailed, we get to see all of this chaos that's breaking out in every train section. The train was only able to survive because of Wilford. Wilford was the one institution that mattered. But after that one institution was taken out, everything just collapsed. Now, although Curtis does decide to derail the train at the end, that was not the intention he started out with. This was an unintended consequence of his revolution. And like I said, we're going to keep coming back to this topic of unintended consequences. Revolutions don't always succeed because in order for a revolution to succeed, it needs to be allied with strong institutions that can back them up. Without those institutions, revolutions always backfire. But civil institutions are not really sexy stories. Imagine that you just paid money to go to watch Les Mis, but instead of hearing these young revolutionaries singing about how they're going to wave these banners against the oppressors, you watch a play about a group of lawyers and NGOs talking about the need to implement proper sewage systems after the king is deposed. No one's going to find that musical fun. But these boring institutions matter. Revolutions are necessary in order to depose kings and autocrats. But these civil institutions that we rely on to keep the lights on, to keep the water running, these are the ones that make sure that society keeps functioning. But in both the real world and in this movie, people did not really stop to think about the question that Gilliam asked. Then what? And that's something that this movie really drills into the audience. Yes, it's easy to be hypnotized into the fervor of revolution. Whether we're talking about the Arab Spring or the Occupy movement or the Tea Party or whatever your brand of politics may be, revolutions are always enthralling. But we must always ask ourselves this question, and then what? And I think this movie does a really good job of making that important point. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this video. But as I said earlier, there are a lot of themes in Snowpiercer. And we're going to go over these themes one at a time. Now, in the next video, we're going to talk about another theme that Bong Joon-ho talks about in a lot of the movies, and that theme is going to be about capitalism. So, this is the end of this video. If you like this video, don't forget to click on the like and subscribe button as well as the notification bell. And if you have a comment, leave it down below. I'm John Lee, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.